Welcome back. I'm Peter St. Onge. This is a weekly roundup of my daily videos on the economy and freedom, where I cut through the BS and lay out what the gaslighting clowns pulled out of their hats this week and what is coming next. Donald Trump is replacing government jobs with real jobs as employment numbers jump, with fully 93% of new jobs in the private sector, as in not bought with government spending. The BLS announced February jobs numbers, which rose by 151,000, up from just 125 in Biden's last job report. That's pretty solid considering thousands of federal layoffs as DOGE hacks away at the 2.4 million army of federal welfare queens who rule us from their swampy lairs. As of last Friday, outplacement giant Challenger Gray tallies 62,242 announced federal layoffs across 17 different agencies, plus 75,000 federal workers who took the voluntary buyouts. And then toss in contractors. There's about 2 federal contractors for every federal employee, and we could be looking at 300,000 people who will no longer be feathering their nest at taxpayer expense, some of whom might even learn how to mow a lawn. Still, we're just starting to see federal layoffs filter into official jobs numbers. We see them in the layoff numbers, but the BLS counted just 10,000 government layoffs last month. While government-funded social assistance, what the Wall Street Journal calls the welfare industrial complex, is still growing, although a lot slower than under Biden. What we do see is day and night from Biden. Government jobs and those government-funded jobs are now less than 1 in 10 new jobs. Under Biden, it was 7 in 10. As for the rest of the economy, the world is healing. Auto jobs jumped 9,000, the most in 15 months. Transportation, warehouse finance all gained. Retail got hit with strikes, but the trend is good. Going by Trump's first term, it gets even better. From 2017 to 19, Trump averaged 175,000 new jobs per month, almost all in the private sector. Still, all that takes time, the investment, the standing up new companies. So for now, we're still coasting on Biden's fumes, with unemployment unchanged at 4.1%, people outside the labor force unchanged at 5 million, and part-time jobs still rising, a theme of Biden's presidency. If one number sums it up, wages are now rising at a robust 4% annualized, but Biden's final inflation number was almost 6%. So what's next? Trump's got a Biden-sized hole to dig out with jobs and wages. He'll take investment, small business deregulation, and mass deportations. I mentioned in recent videos how unemployment only counts people actively looking for work. It doesn't count those 5 million who've given up, who live on government handouts, sleep on mom's couch, or under a bridge. Meaning, as Trump's economy ramps up, we could actually see unemployment rise as those millions gain hope and try their hand at landing a job. Deportations are important for this, self-deportation or otherwise, because illegals occupy the first rungs on the ladder for those discouraged workers. Zooming out on both jobs and growth, we are at a transition from Biden's stagnation to Trump's growth. As that growth kicks in, jobs will pick up, but that's set against layoffs of government workers and contractors, all with potentially millions of Americans coming off these sidelines if growth and deportation pulls wages up at the bottom. So the job numbers may get worse before they get better, even as the economy heals. Donald Trump wants to sell 443 federal buildings, including nearly a fifth of all the office space in Washington, D.C. And all they add up to 80 million square feet of bureaucrat habitat. That's 12 times the size of the Pentagon and comparable to all the office space in San Francisco or Boston. The reason is these buildings are largely empty. Just 6% of federal workers come to the office every day, and a third are fully remote. Yet the buildings cost over $430 million a year to maintain and require over $8 billion in repairs because the feds raid every piggy bank, even their own. Toss in hundreds of thousands of federal layoffs thanks to DOGE, and the buildings just are not needed. The list of properties was posted by the GSA, the federal government's real estate manager, last week, then temporarily taken down since some agencies complained they hadn't been informed. Of course, agencies don't actually own buildings, the American people do, but I guess Trump wanted to be nice. Interestingly, the list is very top-heavy with headquartered buildings. In fact, 1 in 12 agency headquarters were on the list to be auctioned, including, deliciously, the FBI headquarters named after noted secret police J. Edgar Hoover, as well as the largely empty headquarters of the Departments of Labor, Agriculture, HHS, and HUD. Plus the Nancy Pelosi Federal Building in San Francisco, which looks like a Jawa crawler on Tatooine and is twice as expensive. The headquarter fetish suggests they might be going much bigger. After all, the federal government owns precisely 263,000 buildings, so if they auction 1 in 12 of those, it could be tens of thousands of federal buildings turned over to become something useful: office, housing, an indoor mall, senior community, perhaps a circus. Of course, it's not just the buildings they own. The federal government also leases at least 144 million square feet of office space, that's 2 Bostons, at a cost of $5 billion of your tax dollars. Doge has already cut about 100 million of these with another 400 million planned, but it takes time as leases run out. And finally, the big one, land. Nationwide, the federal government hogs up 640 million acres of land. It's almost 3 times the size of Texas and 27% of all the land in America. Much of this it neglects into wildfires, illegal marijuana operations, or dogfighting camps in the Everglades, not a joke. In some states, it owns most of the land. The federal government owns over half of Oregon, 2/3 of Idaho and Utah. In case you wonder why they're so expensive when nobody lives there, it owns almost 90% of Nevada. So 640 million acres conservatively is worth between $1.5 and $2 trillion, and auctioning it could create hundreds of little towns across some of the most pleasant parts of the country. Instead, it is kindling for LA's next wildfire. So what's next? Putting dead federal assets to use will be great for the economy, a nationwide boom of affordable offices for startups, even affordable housing. Given those new tenants and residents actually pay city taxes, unlike the feds, it'll be a godsend for cities that are already desperate for housing. The one loser will be banks sitting on hundreds of billions in distressed real estate loans the Fed is dutifully bailing out, which could soon get competition from freed-up federal assets, even while the American taxpayer gets to offload yet another trillion-dollar monkey on our backs. A word from our lead sponsor, Unchained.com. In the new year, it's time to think about your annual IRA contributions. An IRA is an investment vehicle that can save you a lot of taxes. And with Unchained, you can hold real Bitcoin in your IRA, get access to trading, inheritance, and loans, and it's the only company where you hold the keys and can verify that your Bitcoin is not being relent like banks do. We've seen futures-based ETFs underperform holding your own Bitcoin, so why settle for less? Book a friendly consultation at unchained.com/Peter. If you own gold or silver, you know they're a great hedge against financial instability and let you grow your wealth outside the banking system and gain greater control over your finances. Monetary Metals offers you the ability to increase your precious metal ounces every single month. Instead of paying to own metal, with Monetary Metals, you get paid 4% on your gold paid in more ounces. Now's the time to secure your wealth and build your legacy in an asset that the government cannot inflate away. Join thousands of investors earning interest in physical gold and silver every month with Monetary Metals. Visit monetarymetals.com/Peter to learn more. Now back to our show. Will we get a recession in 2025? Will it stop Trump's economic restoration? Last week, Donald Trump warned there could be a recession this year, adding, quote, "no pain, no gain." Now, the odds were already stacked thanks to Joe Biden, who put us either in recession or right on the edge. 2025 recession odds were nearly 50-50 before the election. They came down into the 20s with Trump's win, but are now back in the 40s. The main reason being federal layoffs and spending cuts that were bigger than markets expected, so both reduced GDP on paper, along with institutional investors selling out of risk assets and actual investment on hold to wait and see on tariffs. In recent videos, I've mentioned that both federal spending cuts and mass deportation cut GDP on paper, since GDP counts spending, not output, when it is the government. Of course, Trump's also pushing tax cuts and deregulation that grow the economy and bring companies home. In an interview with Maria Bartiromo over the weekend, Trump leaned into it, warning there could be a, quote, "period of transition and disruption as we, quote, build a foundation for the future." Treasury Secretary Bessent also warned of, quote, "disruption as the economy, quote, detoxes from government spending." So what happens if we do get a recession? Going by no pain, no gain, Trump will stay the course, cutting spending, cutting red tape, cutting taxes, while continuing the mass deportations and tariffs. The question is political pressure on Congress. So historically, Washington's recession playbook is massive spending, historically $2 trillion plus in additional spending. That would take us to a $4 trillion deficit if cackles had won. Now, going by COVID, Trump does like his stimmies. They bear his signature after all. And the Fed will yank down interest rates, even if Jerome Powell hates Trump. Both drive inflation, but if they're happening specifically because of a federal spending recession, it is exactly paying for a lot of gain. Of course, Congress could gobble up DOGE cuts with brand new spending, but in that case, the recession is canceled. We go back to Biden style buying the GDP. The bigger question is, what should we do if there's a recession? In short, absolutely nothing. Purge the zombies, the federal waste, and the private malinvestment, fart coin and all. Economist Murray Rothbard has a great metaphor for this. If locusts come every 7 years, you get a crash in locust jobs the year after. So should you pay them to sit around for 6 years? Should the Fed yank rates to artificially stimulate everything else? There's a great book on this, The Forgotten Depression by James Graham, describing the 1920 recession when we actually did do absolutely nothing. It was just over a year of pain followed by a golden decade, the Roaring '20s. We did it again in 1946 when we demobilized 11 million soldiers, the mother of federal spending recessions. Again, a short recession, then a decade of boom we call the 1950s. So what's next? If we get a recession, it'll be the healthiest recession in a century. Legacy media will pin it on Trump. Chaos is apparently the mothership-approved term. But if he stays the course with stimmies at worst, we could be looking at a golden decade on the other side. Canadian politicians are spoiling for a fight with Donald Trump, gambling with millions of Canadians struggling after a decade of Justin Trudeau. Last week, Canadian Liberals chose a new Prime Minister, Davos-approved Mark Carney, a man best known as one of the most inflationist central bankers in two recessions, '08 and COVID. Carney immediately went after Trump, declaring, quote, "In trade as in hockey, Canada will win." Meanwhile, Ontario leader Doug Ford slapped export tariffs on electricity to Michigan to spite Trump, promising, quote, "Canada will not back down, we will be relentless." Trump responded, threatening 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum, which would wipe out Ontario's dominant car industry, at which point Doug backed down. So much for relentless. Now, fighting words may be good politics for Canadian politicians rallying round the maple leaf to protect Canada's own tariffs and barriers against American imports. But going to war with Trump is gambling with millions of Canadians. Partly because trade with the U.S. makes up 1/5 of the Canadian economy, but just 1% of the U.S. economy, meaning Canada cannot win a trade war. It needs the U.S. 20 times more than we need them, not even counting free military. But mostly because Canada's economy is half crippled after a lost decade under Trudeau. So Trudeau gave Canadians West Virginia wages and San Francisco home prices. Wages in Canada are flat since 2016. Household debt is the highest in the G7. Economic growth since 2019, so pre-COVID, is the lowest out of 50 developed countries. In Vancouver, Toronto, it takes 70% of middle-class income to buy a house. According to Stats Canada, 40% of middle-class Canadians are living hand-to-mouth, while half of Canadians cannot afford a $200 emergency. That's $200 Canadian. And heaven help you if you try to start a business in Canada, you are volunteering for the slaughter. Recent Ipsos poll found 7 in 10 Canadians think, quote, "Canada is broken." An Angus poll found 42% of Canadians are considering leaving the country. So onto this smoldering heap comes the Trump tariffs and Canada's gambling politicians. So what's next? Trump says tariffs in Canada and Mexico could jump on April 2nd, starting with the products Trump has so far exempted because they're covered by USMCA, Trump's NAFTA replacement. That exempted about 3/4 of trade, meaning Canada has not begun to feel the squeeze. Everything else is coming on April 2nd. The biggest is cars. There's over 120,000 auto workers in Canada, and almost 1 million in Mexico. So what should Canada do? Given 4 million Canadian families are at stake, Canada's leaders should put pride aside and make Trump happy on the border, on fentanyl, perhaps even getting rid of Canada's extortionate trade barriers that block everything from American milk to banks. In other words, give Trump the easy stuff and the stuff that would actually help Canadian consumers in order to protect the existential stuff. Instead, Carney and Ford are pouring gasoline. Now, Canada has an upcoming election where the voters finally get a say, but until then, and maybe after then, given the Conservative keeps putting his foot in it, hapless Canadians remain at the mercy of a government that seems eager to gamble all in on Trump backing down. Given Trump's personality, and given how much leverage he has with a 20-1 trade difference, that is a very risky bet. A word from our sponsor. One of the best ways to secure your Bitcoin is with a hardware wallet, a physical device that lets you keep your coins offline without internet connection. One of the most trusted names in hardware wallets is CoinKite, maker of the famous block clock. CoinKite devices are made in Canada. They're run by passionate Bitcoiners who've been at this since 2012, back when Bitcoiners were trading in person at swap meets. You can pick up hardware wallets and plenty of other goodies at coinkite.com/ProfSaintAnge. That's CoinKite.com/ProfSaintAnge. Okay, back to our show. Donald Trump just cut Biden's inflation in half, including eggs down 30% and now below where they were on Joe Biden's last day. So much for media's doom loop, how tariffs will give us the hyperinflations. And yes, that sound you're hearing is Democrats crying their last good talking point is gone with the eggs. Now they're back to defending transgender operas in Peru. Yesterday, the Bureau of Labor Statistics came out with Trump's very first inflation report card, saying CPI rose just 2.4% annualized on the month. That's way down from Joe Biden's last inflation read of 5.7% annualized. So 3.5 points in 28 days. The new numbers took year-on-year CPI down to 2.8%, which is a stone's throw from the pre-COVID 2.5. Inflation was lower than markets expected on both CPI and core CPI, which excludes food and energy and is considered the more reliable one for underlying inflation. In fact, year-on-year, core is now the lowest since April of 2021, before the Bidenflation nightmare began. Digging in, the biggest jump was housing, which is up 4% annualized, making up a third of all inflation. This was offset by falling energy prices. Gasoline was down 13% annualized on the month, and an absolute plunge in airfares, down 4% on the month, which is 50% annualized. Plunging airfares is a classic recession flag. People stop taking vacations, companies make you do Zoom, but hotel prices are holding up, so that might be more about cheap jet fuel thanks to drill baby drill. Interestingly, new car prices fell while used prices rose. That's interesting because tariffs were supposed to increase new car prices, while deportation should be lowering used cars, lots of extra cars for sale. That could be Americans downgrading from new to used, which is also ominous. The other big one is food. So food inflation dropped by half from annualized 5% to 2.5%. That's despite soaring egg prices. The CPI is on a lag, so it did not count the recent plunge in egg prices. In short, as Zero Hedge put it, goods inflation, stuff you can drop on your foot, is basically zero. What's left is services inflation, which is falling fast. So what's next? If Doge continues slashing federal spending, Bidenflation is done. Toss in Trump's energy policies, which have already dropped oil prices by 15%, plus the cheap eggs, and we could get inflation back to the 2% Americans know and love. I've mentioned in previous videos how tariffs get the headlines, but government spending and money supply are the 800-pound gorillas of inflation. If Doge cuts stick, as in if Congress doesn't just respend it somewhere else, we'll get ongoing drops in inflation as household dollars no longer have to compete with migrant welfare and, yes, transgender operas. Meanwhile, the Fed is actually helping for once, perhaps because Jerome Powell hates Trump and is no longer doing favors for the White House. Either way, at the moment, the Fed is deflationary. High interest rates that reduce bank lending that normally pyramids on the Fed's money printing, and ongoing sell-offs of the Fed's assets that literally cancel out dollars. We may yet see specific jumps in tariffed imports, but Trump is off to a heck of a start. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and go to petersanons.com for daily videos and in-depth articles with charts and all the gory details. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.